one of a kind, the only naval warship to serve in both world wars.
A date which will live in infamy.
Now she's battling her most serious enemy yet, time. After serving with such distinction in the last century, she deserves nothing less in the next. Brad Woodard, 11 News.
The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, or TPWD, has been challenged with a huge and inspiring endeavor: the preservation and protection of the historic battleship Texas. The agency's task, as mandated by the Texas Legislature and the Legislative Budget Board, is to place Texas in a permanent dry berth. In October of 2010, a diverse team of experts, led by AECOM, was carefully selected by TPWD to aid them in accomplishing this significant task. TPWD Project Manager Neil Thomas tells us more.
As the project manager for Texas Parks and Wildlife, it's my charge to ensure that this project adheres to the 3 requirements set forth in the RFQ. Beyond those requirements, however, I feel that the success of the dry berth project is contingent upon 3 big picture ideals: those of respect, teamwork, and communication. It is TPWD's desire to respect all the resources at play on the project. Throughout all phases of the project, we will be committed to respecting the cultural, natural, and fiscal resources we have. Our task is clear: to dry berth the battleship. But in order to accomplish this task, we must forge a sense of respect and open communication between TPWD, the U.S. Navy, and all the interested stakeholders that will endure throughout the project, regardless of the outcome. If we do this, it will be possible to do the best thing for the ship, the best thing for the battleground, and to be good stewards of the cultural, natural, and fiscal resources belonging to the citizens of Texas. This project will achieve a viable solution to a very complex problem. The solution, however, must be in sync with federal partners, must comply with federal regulations, and must consider a multitude of invested stakeholders. The only way forward, then, is through a team approach, built on mutual respect and open communication with all the parties involved.
Throughout Phase 1 of the project, the TPWD AECOM team has been hard at work to provide the study, analysis, and coordination necessary to launch into the next project phase. TPWD Ship Manager Andy Smith has provided Neil with as-needed project support during the entire process.
For me as the Ship Manager of Texas, the Phase 1 activities I was most focused on were 3 things. I set a priority on reversibility, that we could undo the proposed solution and that no permanent changes are made to Texas. The second was to make sure the impact of the dry berth project on the battleground was considered and mitigated. Finally, and equally important, was that the solution is more economically viable over a very long term for the overall operations and management of the ship.
Keeping these requirements in mind, the TPWD AECOM team has accomplished the following during Phase 1. Evaluation of the battleship's current condition. Studies and surveys, including geotechnical, topographical, bathymetric, natural, and cultural resources constraints analysis. Development of siting constraints. Regulatory coordination. Stakeholder outreach. Evaluation of the Proceanic Report on dry berth options. Identification, preliminary design preparation, and cost estimates of temporary mooring locations during construction, and development of 4 dry berth design options and cost estimates for each. AECOM Project Manager Jerry Farhat led this carefully planned Phase 1 effort.
I am Jerry Farhat, AECOM Project Manager for the Texas Dry Berth Project. It is an honor for me to manage the many moving parts of this significant project.
To develop dry berth design criteria for moving Texas, temporarily and permanently, the design team needed to understand the ship's current condition, risks associated with moving her, geotechnical criteria affecting foundation decisions, final aesthetics while in dry berth, visitor access to the ship, achievement of reversibility, stakeholder feelings about siting and design decisions, and regulatory agency involvement.
Scott McCoy of Halcrow directed temporary mooring investigations for the Battleship Texas, including on-site and off-site alternatives.
Our role on the AECOM team was threefold. First, we performed a site selection study of temporary berthing locations for Texas. This effort considered the possibility or desirability of moving her to a temporary location during dry berth construction. We investigated existing docks in the Houston Ship Channel area to see if they could meet TPWD's needs during the construction period. And we worked with the design team to examine whether we could construct a temporary berth at the current location. We were also tasked with reviewing the options developed by the team for the permanent dry berth.
At the onset of Phase 1, based on the alternatives in the Proceanic report, it was assumed Texas would need to be moved to a temporary off-site berth during construction. The Halcro team responded to this need by studying sites throughout the Houston Ship Channel for temporary placement of Texas, considering ongoing operations, visitor access, navigability for the battleship, and cost of implementation. As the team progressed into Phase 1, in-depth vessel inspections revealed that moving Texas into the Houston Ship Channel could present considerable risk to the ship, and cost estimates produced for temporary mooring options on and off-site were prohibitive. The team responded by developing design options that eliminated the necessity of off-site mooring facilities.
Roger Courtney of AECOM led the team in terms of landscape architecture and aesthetic considerations for the dry berth configuration of Texas, coordinating design, cultural resources, and the visitor experience.
Our role in Phase 1 was to consider the aesthetic presentation of the Texas, particularly with respect to presentation of the battleship, preservation of the integrity of the battleground, visitor safety, and visitor access. Working closely with the design team, we responded with development of landscape, site plan, and cross-sectional dry berth design options. We looked at the aesthetic and technical issues associated with access, drainage, planting, and vegetation concerns in the design of the berth slopes. We studied berth slope stabilization, and we began to look at berth siting options in the wider context of landside, program, and battleground relationships. We have also been involved in the initiation of the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 consultation process.
Roger and his team worked seamlessly with the design team to coordinate the visitor experience for each design option, including site planning and circulation, visitor access and egress, and innovative temperature control efforts within the basin.
Mike Hasen of HVJ led the geotechnical analysis for Phase 1. HVJ developed critical geotechnical data for designing alternatives.
The geotechnical studies performed during Phase 1 are critical to any siting decision related to the dry berth project. In our investigation, we analyzed subsurface soil and groundwater conditions associated with the current ship's mooring. The primary output of this analysis was information we must have to design a foundation for the dry berth that will support the Texas. Using the information we developed, we then coordinated very closely with the design team to evaluate the application of sheet pile cofferdams, king piles, and excavated slopes, all of which are options for construction of a dry berth.
To consider moving the battleship to an off-site location, either temporarily or permanently, the team needed to understand her current condition and the risks associated with moving her. AECOM conducted high-definition scanning, or HDS, for 85% of the vessel. The HD scanning efforts provide an invaluable blueprint of the ship's precise condition today, prior to construction. This data provided TPWD with accurate measurements of each frame of the battleship, organized by 360-degree images and videos of each compartment of the ship. This information will be key during the final design efforts for a dry berth, and it can be utilized to propel public education and awareness efforts for the battleship. Additionally, a hull assessment, including dive surveys, was carried out by Ocean Technical Services. The HD scans and hull investigations revealed surprising and alarming news about Texas's fragile condition.
Joe Lombardi, recognized as a leading expert in historical ship preservation, surveyed the battleship's current condition and provided recommendations for repair options.
My effort on Phase 1 was to perform a detailed structural analysis of Battleship Texas. As part of that effort, my subcontractor performed a diving assessment on the underwater hull to determine, very importantly, a bottom profile showing us the status of the battleship where she is currently berthed. We learned that the hull is sitting on the bottom. My team also performed a study of the hull thickness and mooring structures, Very importantly, we performed a stability analysis giving us vital information about what may happen when we move the ship. We learned that a great deal of repair must be performed on Battleship Texas before she can be safely moved.
Patty Matthews of AECOM coordinated with several teams across the nation to lead cultural resources, environmental, and public involvement efforts. This team includes representatives from AECOM, SWCA, TBG, and Crouch Environmental Services.
My role in Phase 1 was to lead initial cultural resource and environmental study efforts in preparation for compliance with 2 federal regulations in Phase 2, the National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA, and the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Throughout Phase 1, we coordinated with the Department of Navy, Naval Sea Systems Command, or NAVSEA, the lead federal agency for this project.
NAVSEA is directing the NHPA consultation process and NEPA compliance efforts. Under NAVSEA guidance, TPWD has initiated the NHPA consultation process and begun preliminary consideration of alternatives for NEPA through the development of the Description of Proposed Action and Alternatives, or DOPA. The team will continue to coordinate closely with NAVSEA throughout Phase 2 of this project.
We began Phase 1 by reviewing existing documentation of historic cultural resources for the current site. This information was compiled into a cultural resources constraints analysis. Public involvement is a critical part of NEPA, and we initiated this effort in Phase 1 by hosting a stakeholder workshop in May. This workshop was attended by federal, state, and local agency representatives, as well as members of key stakeholder groups. Initial comments were collected and a comprehensive workshop summary report was compiled. This report is available on the project website. Stakeholder information, as well as initial cultural and natural resources studies compiled during Phase 1, will provide a foundation for NEPA and NHPA coordination in Phase 2.
24 stakeholders attended the May workshop. The workshop commenced with a project briefing by TPWD project manager Neil Thomas, and a group discussion of project plans and recommendations followed. Attendees were given an opportunity to submit written comments. A majority of the comments received were in favor of a dry berth at the ship's existing location adjacent to the San Jacinto Battleground State Historic Site, while other comments expressed a desire to relocate the ship to an alternative site. Group and individual comments were collected orally and in writing, and documentation of all comments received at this workshop is included in the workshop summary report. TPWD remains committed to providing ways that all the stakeholders can remain meaningfully engaged in the process as the project continues.
In order for the design team to develop alternatives, we required information from our team, including Joseph Klein, Shubhra Misra, Rachel Lloyd, and others. Joseph Klein will tell us more.
My role on the team was to develop the on-site dry berth alternatives you're going to see today. Critical design considerations included the foundation layout and development of cross-sections for the keel block loads. In terms of alternative development, we relied on the scope of work, the Proceanic report prepared in 2008, and additional goals voiced by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department during our regular progress meetings.
By creatively sequencing construction and prioritizing resources, we're prepared to provide a durable and aesthetically beautiful solution to dry berth the Battleship Texas. Here are the 4 most promising dry berthing options that the team is putting forward for consideration, selected from the numerous alternatives developed and considered by the team during Phase 1. While each of these options meets the project's basic design criteria, they differ in the extent to which they meet other project goals. Visitor safety and amenities, Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA compliance, and visual aesthetics, including landscaping, would be an integral part of every design you will see today. Vegetation included in the visual representation you're seeing today is purely representational at this juncture. Stormwater and seepage drainage have also been taken into consideration for each alternative design. Please note that design options are identified by numbers 1 through 4. However, this naming convention does not indicate preference or favor on behalf of the TPWD AECOM team. Option 1 would utilize Texas's current berth location for the construction of the dry berth. A cantilevered king pile bulkhead would separate the wet berth from the waters of the Houston Ship Channel, and sloped earthen revetments, or retaining walls, would be excavated around the perimeter of the dry berth. The layout would retain the existing south side bulkhead. During construction, the battleship would be transferred to a temporary wet berth located east of her current position. This wet berth would be comprised of temporary sheet piles and located just west of Independence Parkway. This temporary berthing option precludes risks associated with towing Texas into the Houston Ship Channel, and it provides a direct, straight pathway for Texas into and out of the wet berth. This option proposes to construct the closure cofferdam on the west and the dikes on the other sides before transferring the ship to the wet berth. With the top of the entire perimeter of the dry and wet berths elevated above elevation plus 13 feet for flood protection, water would be pumped into the dry and wet berths to raise their water level to elevation plus 12 feet, thereby raising the ship from its present position. The ship would be transferred to the wet berth while this superflooded elevation is maintained, and would remain in this elevated position in the wet berth for the remainder of construction. This approach minimizes the amount of dredging needed for ship transfer and allows the dry berth slab to be constructed at relatively shallow elevation minus 26 feet, minimizing dry berth excavation and footprint. Once the ship is moved, the dry berth would be dewatered to allow construction of the keel block foundation and excavation of revetment slopes. The foundation would be pile supported, with hydraulic uplift pressure relieved by a grid of under-drain pipes collecting seepage water beneath the dry berth foundation. Once construction of the foundation is complete, keel blocks would be laid down and the dry berth would again be superflooded to meet the elevated water level in the wet berth. The west wall of the wet berth would be breached so that Texas could be transferred into her new home. Bringing the pool elevation back down, Texas would be seated onto the keel blocks and then secured into a location about 50 feet west of her existing location. The temporary wet berth would be deconstructed and construction of the eastern portion of the dry berth would be completed. Following her placement on the keel blocks, Texas would be approximately 5 feet above her current height, providing a minimal increase in visual impact on the site. The basin walls of Option 1 would be vegetated slopes with a wraparound access ramp leading down to the basin slab. Visitor and maintenance access to the ship would be achieved through a gangway located on the north side of the dry berth. Supplementary egress would be provided by a staircase on the south side of the ship, extending from Texas's main deck down to the basin slab. One disadvantage of the superflooding concept is that reversibility, the ability to launch a refurbished Texas into the channel at a future date, would be a complex and expensive proposition. All 4 of the dry berth options presented are reversible, although the amount of effort and money required to achieve reversibility varies from option to option. The unique superflooding aspect of Option 1, however, dictates that the ship would rest in her new dry berth at a height that would not allow her to float off the blocks at the channel's normal water levels. This makes the reversibility of this option the most complex of the options considered. Option 2. Option 2 is similar to the previous option, but without superflooding. It also includes vegetated sloped revetments constructed within the site of Texas's current wet berth. Without the process of superflooding, this option would require a deeper foundation at elevation minus 38 feet, 12 feet lower than Option 1. Because of this added depth, the width of the entire dry berth would be greater, and there would be greater land-side impacts directly north of the existing berth. To protect the existing south side bulkhead from undermining by the proposed excavation, the dry berth and the temporary wet berth would be offset about 50 feet north of the ship's existing location. Following construction of the dry berth, Texas would be about 7 feet lower than her existing height, offering less of a visual impact to the battleground site. Option 3. Option 3 offers a different siting location, utilizing land just north of the current mooring location. Like Option 2, a foundation depth of minus 38 feet is needed. This option has the largest land-side impact of the alternatives presented here and has wetland impact as well. Unlike the previous options presented, Texas would remain in her existing location during construction, with only minimal modifications to existing ship utility services required. Besides reducing the amount of temporary work needed, this feature would allow Texas to remain open to visitors throughout the dry berth construction process. The dry berth construction would likely be an interesting attraction for visitors to the site, to the extent that construction zone access could be safely allowed. As in option 2, Texas would rest 7 feet lower than the existing height when seated on the keel blocks. Like the previous design options, the basin walls of option 3 would be vegetated slopes with a wraparound access ramp down to the basin foundation. Dredging of the western section of the existing wet berth and the new dry berth would be required for this design option, and this is the only option that would require that Texas be towed into the Houston Ship Channel to enter the dry berth. Given the results of recent hull assessment surveys and HDS data, Texas's voyage into the Houston Ship Channel, although of short duration, could be risky. It would also require U.S. Coast Guard permitting. Design option 4 differs from the previous alternatives in terms of structural design and placement of the battleship itself. The dry berth would be constructed northeast of the existing mooring location and would be constructed using an anchored reinforced concrete slurry wall around the perimeter of the berth and a cantilevered steel king pile wall at its entrance. The ship would be berthed diagonally in relation to her current position, and she would be dry berthed in close proximity to Independence Parkway. This option would result in the smallest footprint of the 4 options presented today, and it would also allow Texas to remain at her existing mooring during construction. As in option 3, visitors would be allowed on the vessel throughout the dry berth construction process. Although this option is located closer to the San Jacinto Monument, Texas would rest 7 feet lower than her existing height, reducing visual impacts to the battleground. A wraparound ramp would provide access to the basin foundation, providing at-grade access on the south side of the dry berth. Unlike the other 3 alternatives, the service facilities and main access gangway would be located south of the dry berth. This option would provide an auxiliary gangway on the north for supplementary egress and maintenance use. This option also allows the flexibility to intentionally flood the dry berth for extended periods of time with minimal impact to the dry berth structure. Additional, more detailed design and background information is provided in the Dry Berth of Battleship Texas State Historic Site Phase 1 Conceptual Design Report for TPWD review and consideration. Our team is committed to providing a dry berth design that meets the needs expressed by NAVSEA, aligns with the goals of TPWD, and instills pride and a sense of the historical significance of the battleship in every person who steps aboard the mighty Texas. Lori Baer, AECOM Associate Vice President and Project Coordinator for the Dry Berth Project, concludes today's presentation with the team's final thoughts.
Today, the Battleship Texas Dry Berth Project team proudly presents 4 viable on-site berth design alternatives for consideration by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. During this Phase 1 process, a multifaceted and thorough examination of constraints and contributing factors was achieved. This effort ranged from an in-depth marine survey of the battleship to geotechnical and structural analyses, and from stakeholder and agency coordination to environmental and cultural resource studies. The accomplishments of Phase 1 will propel the team forward to complete our tasks for Phase 2. As we initiate and complete the NHPA and NEPA compliance processes, we have the facts, the understanding, and the relationships to ensure that this project is a success. Operating in alignment with the leadership and guidance we receive from our TPWD project manager, Neil Thomas, our team's success will be achieved through a strong commitment to communication, teamwork, and respect throughout the project. Fully enthused by this great challenge, we continue to be honored to be here today, providing resourceful and worthy solutions for the citizens of Texas. We are on board and ready to participate in creating Battleship Texas's permanent place in history.
It's when the guns are firing efficiently.